Welcome to this episode of Life Science Success. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Don. I'm a consultant in life sciences, and there's a weekly series that I've been running. We actually had it on pause last week. Next week, it'll be on pause again for Thanksgiving. But for those of you who would like to join and learn more about ways to scale your organization, you can go to thescalingmethod.com/thoughts at scale. And this week's session actually deals with multi-channel communication. So if you're a part of an organization that's growing and you're trying to figure out exactly how do you make sure that you stay in touch both with the people internal to your organization as well as those outside of your organization, Thoughts at Scale is a great way to do that. And it's another LinkedIn event that I have. So it's tomorrow at noon Eastern is when that event goes live. So with that, let me bring in my guest this week. So in this episode of Life Science Success, my guest is Bob Rochelle. He's the Chief Commercial Officer at Cleveland Diagnostics, and he's a proven expert in launch strategy and marketing for novel healthcare products. So with that, welcome, Bob.
Good afternoon, Don. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And for those of you who saw, by the way, that we were going to have Dr. Chait on, there was a last minute switch because Dr. Chait, unfortunately, my understanding was, Bob, that he's experiencing some sort of travel delay. So anybody that's done that understands.
Right. Travel is indeed exotic.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. As everybody seems to think. So, Bob, would you mind taking just a moment and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Again, thanks for having me, Don. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for Cleveland Diagnostics. 35 years of healthcare industry experience, some of it on the pharmaceutical side, but at this point in my career, I'd say most of it has been on the diagnostic side. I've worked in a variety of therapeutic and diagnostic areas, ranging from plain vanilla antibiotics to antihypertensive drugs, dyslipidemia, onto more sophisticated products like genetic disease diagnostics and most recently cancer. I've worked with Fortune 100 companies, but most of my career has been in the small startup realm. And as we chatted about before we went live, I think it takes a certain kind of pathology to work in a small startup environment, but I love it, and I keep beating myself over a hammer over it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And
Sure.
what led you to want to be a part of the small startup environment in the first place?
Yeah, I started off at the bench level, so there's a certain I love the science behind every technology. I grew into a pseudo business role with a small startup and learned quickly that I knew nothing about business. So I went off to business school, learned the 4 Ps and the 3 Cs and all the good stuff you read in all the textbooks. And then I wanted to land at a big company with big budgets, big marketing, big product. And I went to Abbott Laboratories. That gave me a great background. I spent 7 or 8 years there training and growing through the ranks. But as I grew through the ranks, I realized that, there was more out there and that I wanted to not control, but I wanted to be part of something I could move along a little more quickly than had I been at a large company.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me because the comment that you had made to me was that you could be everywhere from the chief whatever all the way down to the bottle washer. And I remember coming into COVID, being in a small startup at that point in time, and there was a point in the day where the bathrooms had to be cleaned, and so I finished that and then went to like an executive meeting right afterwards, and it was ironic at the same time, but it was one of those moments where you're just like, look, there isn't a service that's coming in between now and whenever I get out, and frankly, this is not acceptable, so the trash has got to be removed.
It's certainly CEO and chief bottle washer most of the time around our shop and with any small company. The good side of that is if you get an idea, you usually can carry it through pretty quickly without layers and layers of bureaucracy and structure. The bad news is you don't have the resources that you did at an Abbott or a Merck or a Pfizer or what have you. to
Yeah.
get those things done. So it requires you to focus on fewer things and get fewer things. It's not the mile wide, inch thick thing. You need to go deeper onto fewer things and get that done.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree that you have to be able to shift your mind pretty rapidly between what strategically does the company need to hit, and then also what tactically, closer to yourself do you need to go do.
That's correct. Right.
Yeah. So looking back at your career, there've been a lot of pivotal moments that sort of brought you to the point that you're at today at Cleveland Diagnostics. I guess I'm just interested to hear, though, as a part of your journey. So, for those of you who don't know about Bob's journey, so you were at Abbott, you were a consultant as well, and then, I've seen you as well as both board member and then at Exact Sciences as well as now Cleveland Diagnostics. And just interested to hear about what brought you to this particular point.
Yeah, I think there are three or four things that I always look for in a new opportunity, and the kids these days, they jump around once every minute and a half, right? But I'm more, I wouldn't like to say loyal, but I spend 5, 6, 7 years with a company and really invest. As I mentioned earlier, Don, I spent a lot of time behind the bench, so I really invest myself in the technology. I like to understand the details. So one checkbox that needs to be checked for me is it has to be novel technology.
Mm.
And certainly at Cleveland Diagnostics, we've developed a novel platform technology that's expandable across the diagnostics of various cancers. I think people is important too. You got to have great people in the right positions, the right time, the right skill set. I need to see a path to success, right? There's a lot of great technologies out there that will never see the market, or will see the market but will never be able to ramp, or never get able to get reimbursed. And then last but certainly not least, it's about helping people, right? And making sure everybody wants a legacy. Everybody wants a feather in their cap. I launched that product. I launched that product. But if you're launching a stick of gum, or you're launching a new toy from Mattel, that's a little bit different than launching a new cancer diagnostic that's going to save people unnecessary biopsies, or on the flip side, diagnose the cancer early when it can be treatable.
And is there anything specifically that led you towards more of the cancer side as well, or is it as long as it's in the healthcare space and new and novel, that then you would be happy? So if it were an Alzheimer's,
I think
in that
in
space.
the earlier stages of the company that was called Exact Laboratories before I joined, we renamed it as Exact Sciences, and then we launched the precursor to Cologuard. You see the little white box dancing across the screen every night. We launched that product, and I think that was my first role in cancer. And what I realized was there are so many aspects to cancer, from tumor suppressor genes, oncogenes, microsatellite instability, on and on and on, hereditary factors, and so forth. I guess I'm jabbing myself in the eye with a sharp stick when I keep going back to these companies that get more and more sophisticated. But
Yeah.
cancer is obviously a horrible, horrible, egregious situation. There's some really bad actors out there, cancer included, really bad health conditions. But many of the diseases, including cancer, can be treated and even cured if detected early. So that's the upside to it. So, I got sort of enamored with the cancer space through my time with Exact Sciences, and then the bookending it with prostate cancer diagnostics. We're getting into breast cancer with Cleveland Diagnostics.
Perfect. So, in terms of Cleveland Diagnostics, why don't we just talk a little bit about the company and what you have today in terms of products, especially release products as well?
Sure, sure. So Cleveland Diagnostics is you can consider us a protein-based liquid biopsy company, right? We apply that proprietary platform to various cancers in the areas of screening, in the areas of reflex testing, in the areas of monitoring and surveillance. And each of them have their own specific specific, sort of definition. But there's a wide array of cancers that we can apply our proprietary platform to, and in a wide variety of ways that the doctors can use it. The company was founded about 10 years ago, Don, in partnership with Cleveland Clinic right around the corner here. And we did launch our first product, which is in the area of prostate cancer diagnostics, based on our proprietary platform in 2020, which was right in the middle of the pandemic. So that was an interesting challenge as well. The product is called ISO-PSA. It's included in all the major guidelines from the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, or NCCN, AUA, the American Urological Association, some European guidelines. It's covered by Medicare and a few commercial plans, although we're evolving in the reimbursement realm. And we anticipate FDA approval sometime next year. We're going to be filing very shortly. So what that does for us is, instead of launching the product or running the product in our own CLIA CAP accredited laboratory, we can expand it into hospitals, expand it into IDNs, expand it into the primary care setting, for example.
Perfect. And then I read something on your website about the SIA platform. Can you tell us more about what that is?
Yeah, so SIA is what we call the Solvent Interaction Analysis Platform, and that's the basis for all of our technologies. So you can kind of think of it, Don, as a molecular or a protein filter. You and I, if we're over the age of 50, for men who are looking to be screened for prostate cancer, we'll typically go in and have our blood drawn. But it's a far from perfect test. So just like mammography for breast cancer or low dose CT for lung cancer, these tests have great screening utility. In other words, they correctly identify cancer when it is present. Unfortunately, things like PSA, mammography, and low-dose CT for those three cancers have horrible specificity, which means they incorrectly call a negative a negative. In other words, they'll incorrectly call it as it'll be a false positive. So what happens with me if I have a high or rising prostate-specific antigen test, a PSA test, I may be called on by my primary care physician or urologist to go on to MRI, to go on to biopsy, and the vast, vast majority of those are false positives. And you've undergone these invasive procedures, these costly procedures, anxiety-provoking procedures. So what we do with our SIA platform is yours or my blood would be drawn. It would be exposed to this water, polymer, other additives kind of mixture. And the proteins that tend to be associated with cancer segregate among this bilayer protein filter, if you will. And then we expose it to normal immunoanalysis like PSA and free PSA. What the test does then is it returns by algorithm what we call the ISO-PSA index, which gives you a very accurate read of your risk of having high-grade cancer and needing to follow up with those things like urology, MRI, biopsy, and worst of all, the treatments, which are prostatectomy, radiation, and or hormones. So what we basically do is, instead of looking for mere concentration of PSA in our blood, we look at the structure of that PSA. So for example, you and I, if we're over 50, between the ages of 50 to 70, we'll go to our primary care physician. If we're over something called 4 nanograms per milliliter, they may kick you up to a urologist. But unfortunately, PSA is a sometimes indicator of cancer, but it can be elevated for any number of other reasons, such as having sex the night before, riding a bike the day before, or simply, more often than not, an enlarged prostate, a condition called BPH or benign prostatic hyperplasia, can raise the PSA level into an area of concern. But then again, 3/4 of the PSAs that are elevated show nothing on biopsy.
Right. Right. My family physician has already said that, for me, she just said, look, unless you show some other symptoms somewhere else, or you start to show in your blood test as we screen you for other things that you need to have an analysis done. We're not doing it because there's too many false positives and too many biopsies from at least my local physician's perspective. So,
and I will tell you this, my primary care physician, who is a wonderful diagnostician, sat me down. I had a PSA that was somewhat normal years ago, and then she wanted me to do another one. And she basically read me that riot act. The test is pretty good as a screening tool. It'll really catch all the cancers if there are cancers, but it's hopelessly nonspecific. It's going to send we way too. What do you want to do, Bob? So basically, she's off the hook either way, because if Bob says, I don't want to do it, then in the chart she writes patient,
opted out.
Not opted out. And if I go onto a PSA, fine, let's do it. That's a big problem with the existing test. Now, you touched on a point which is very important, which is back in the 2011-2012 timeframe. The United States Preventative Services Task Force, USPSTF, said exactly the same, came to the conclusion you did, which was PSA is causing more harm than good. Well, guess what happened? Because we took away the most powerful blood-based diagnostic out there, which is sometimes misses cancer or sometimes miscalls cancer when there's no cancer there, guess what happened? All the primary care physicians stopped doing PSAs, and then we found that prostate cancer spiked. So there's always a balance in so many of these things where you've got to use the tools appropriately. You've got to augment those tools with tests like what we're trying to do with ISO-PSA, make the PSA that's there even more informative by looking for the cancer-related protein structures rather than simply protein concentration in your blood.
Right. So important to know as well that, the idea of diagnostics advancing through time and not staying locked in on previous technologies, because the technologies even that are coming in terms of being able to monitor liquid biopsy tests the base platforms are improving. And so then we can even improve diagnostics even further.
That's exactly right. And even as a reflex test, and what I mean by that is a test you do after the initial test. So I have a higher rising PSA. A reflex test might be ISO-PSA. Another test, for example, is MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. A lot of doctors are quick to pull the trigger on going to MRI after a higher rising PSA, and somewhat misguidedly thinking that that's a definitive diagnostic, but it is not. The only definitive diagnostic is prostate biopsy. So what they'll do is they'll pull the trigger and put you in a big machine, charge you $1,000, and they'll find a lump or a bump or a darkening or whatnot. Not too dissimilar from a dense breast tissue with a mammography or something, and it turns out to be nothing. So MRI is evolving as a tool to make biopsy better, not as its own diagnostics. So what I mean by that is there are things called fusion biopsies, which I might go under an MRI. They might find a lump or a bump imaging wise, but the real value of that MRI is not to diagnose, but to guide the biopsy when that biopsy is done. So all of these diagnostics, all of these screening tools, all these surveillance tools are morphing and changing roles, if you will, as we go along.
Yeah, so important to understand that evolution as well, and what might happen if, somebody does test, one way or the other with an existing test. Having a reflex diagnostic, makes a lot of sense as well to move to a more specific, technology, overall.
Right.
Can you discuss a significant challenge that you've faced in your career and what you've learned from it?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest concerns we have at Cleveland Diagnostics and just about every small startup I've been involved in, we're hardly a startup anymore, but is focus or lack of focus,
Mm.
right? Too many companies spend a lot of time, and you're in fundraising mode all the time when you're in a small startup. So you want to promise everything to everybody, and you want to say that you can do 20 different things, but what you really ought to do is focus on three or four things and go deep into that to prove the concept. A lot of companies will go a mile wide and an inch thick and not really progress or waste a lot of capital or waste a lot of time and energy and resources. So I think focus is really an important lesson. I've been in companies that have done that very, very well. I've been in companies that have not done so well, and it all comes out in the wash. I would say on a personal basis, a lesson I've learned is, um, I don't know, and I've listened to some of your other podcasts, Don, and I respect a lot of what other people are saying about teamwork and about family and what have you. In the end, it's hard to say this, but you're not a family, right? In some cases, it is just business. So you can't take things as personally if your wife or husband said them to you, right? It's just business. We're all trying to move things forward, and you can't take things too personally. Having said that, you also, as a leader in the company, have to realize these are real people with real problems and real concerns and real emotions, and I have them as well. So you have to be aware of that too. So it's a balance between understanding that, when a decision is made, it's a decision and it's just business, balancing that with you were talking about real people with real emotions and real issues.
Yeah, and it is an interesting sort of balance that you have to strike, right? I mean, I I, I know that in larger corporate America, there are big goals and big things that you're going out to do. But when all of those big goals kind of funnel down to one body inside of the organization because you're so
Right.
small, it's
Right.
it's very hard. I mean, I go back a couple years ago, coming into Christmas, there were people, standing around as we're about to close for Christmas, still,
Right.
compiling data to be able to submit things for different clients that we had. And yeah, it's when everything funnels to those one or two resources that you have. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really unfortunate to see as well.
And I'll share another thing with you. This stuck with me when I was as a director level in Abbott, which is a pretty big job, I guess, at Abbott. I felt that I was a big shot until I was invited to the annual directors ball, and there were 420 of us in the company. The company at the time, before it was Abbott and AbbVie, kind of bifurcated. And we went through some sensitivity training at the director level. I'm sharing this with you and your audience because it was so important. And 25 years ago, I went through this, and I'm still telling this story. That's how impactful it was. I think there was some gender bias or racial bias going on at some level in some division or something. And they did a sensitivity training. And, you go in and you get your free bagel and you get your coffee and whatever. And you're like, it's 8 o'clock in the morning. I don't want to do this, right? So they do the jokes and they do the opening exercise to get people talking and so forth. And I'm like, oh my God, I've done this 100 times. They had 8 easels set around the room. I don't know whether you've seen this exercise before, but the 8 easels were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 8. There are directors in the thing. There was a card on the table face down at everybody's seat, and we're all high performers. We're all type A's. We're gonna win this task, right? Don't turn the card over. He said in 30 seconds we're gonna have you turn the card over and count the number of F's, the letter F that appears on the page. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Turn it over. They give you 30 seconds to count the number of F's. Okay, turn it over. Now go stand by the easel that represents the number of F's on your card. Yeah, a few set at 4, a few at 5, a few at 7, a few at 8, and so on and so forth. Okay, look at your shoes. Okay, now in a second, I'm going to have you look up, and connect with somebody at a different easel. So Don, you're at 5 and I'm at 7. 1, 2, 3. I look at you, exchange cards, do the exercise again. Now you were at 5, I was at 7. We both end up at 6. And we're looking at each other like, this guy is an idiot. He can't even count letters. You do this a few more times and everybody in the room ends up at 7 and 8. The deal was, and here's the punchline, the cards were identical. The carriage returns were in different places, the fonts were different, the colors were different, but the cards were identical. Here's the point. Diversity is good. Diversity is nothing more than a different background that in the work setting that you bring to the table, or that you bring to a challenge, or that you bring to a problem. Yeah. And so I keep remembering that. So that's always a challenge for us, not particularly at Cleveland Diagnostics, but in a lot of small companies where the next hire is so important as opposed to the 10,000th hire. So the culture is really important. The diversity is important. And I'm not just talking about racial diversity or what have you. It's all kinds of diversity, young, old, experienced, inexperienced, different industries and so forth. So that's also, I think, very important at this stage.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's interesting to me because I just had a conversation earlier today with a leader who was saying that for a particular role that they're interviewing people for, they have really looked at over 30 candidates because of that very problem. They have such an issue with, what if we pick the wrong person? And it's kind of comes back to a couple of other things that, organizationally that you can do in terms of analyzing, your organization before you even put out that next requisition, so that like, I know specifically who I need. Now the question is, does the environment have that individual somewhere, right? And you have a bit of matching that has to go on, but the secondary part that you have is, too much groupthink is a challenge for any organization, right, as well. And as we all start to listen to each other, all of a sudden the ideas do start to synchronize a little bit. But whenever we come from different perspectives, we start from that alternate view, which helps the organization grow as well. And so, yeah, I completely agree. It's something that all organizations, no matter what the size, should be considering, and making sure that you're not having too much of the same sort of DNA, not necessarily being like your human DNA, but the makeup of the individual as they come in, looking and seeming the same. Too much would be, detrimental to any organization, because you're never going to have a different view, a different point of view then, and that could be a struggle. Yeah.
Right.
So Bob, there are 3 questions that I like to ask every guest. What inspires you?
What inspires me? I think, this is going to sound lofty, but, the ability to impact people's lives, right? And that's why I keep going down the dark hole of cancer right now, is because I think cancer really, it touches virtually everyone. I mean, either personally, directly, indirectly, secondarily or what have you, cancer touches us all in some way, shape, or form. So being able to impact people's lives, and in our case, reducing the number of unnecessary procedures in patients that have low grade or no cancer is important. Catching cancers early when other technologies, even MRIs and biopsies, are imperfect. And we've caught cancers where the MRIs or biopsies have missed, but a secondary biopsy has found it. We've found cancers that were predicted 18 months in advance that converted to high grade. Catching cancers early where you can make a difference, and also avoiding unnecessary procedures like ISO-PSA does, impacting people's lives, is important. And I think a little bit less important, but also important to me, is making a difference in the healthcare system. So in the United States, we used to be the #1 healthcare system in the world, no longer, right? We're fraught with redundancies and expenses and what have you. And if you can find a way to get the right people to biopsy, for example, and avoid the unnecessary biopsies or avoid unnecessary MRIs. Good for the patient, good for their healthcare system. So I'd say those two things, Don, kind of drive me.
Perfect. What concerns you?
Concerns me. Well, the biggest thing that I face every single day is reimbursement challenges, right? So in the healthcare setting, um, getting paid is important. I think the landscape is littered with biotech and other healthcare companies that have great ideas, great technologies, unique and fantastic patent coverage. It's also littered with companies. Some of them can get a product to market, and some of them can actually scale. Um, but unfortunately, many of them, and I've lived this both on the good side and the bad side, um, it's once they realize that reimbursement is not coming or it's a big problem, it's too late. It's like
Right.
boiling that frog. When I joined this company and when I've joined other companies, and I tell them that it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years to get Medicare reimbursement, or it's going to take another couple of years to get United Healthcare or Cigna or Aetna or any of the major regional players, they look at me like I have three heads.
Yeah.
Either they think Bob's not the right guy for the job, or we got into the wrong business. And I don't know which one is more true, but reimbursement really keeps me up at night, and we're continuing to work that. Fortunately, we've gotten into guidelines, we've gotten Medicare reimbursement, we're making some headway with some of the commercial plans, but it is a long haul. And keeping at a smaller company, keeping enough dry powder until you can get paid or paid handsomely for the product you put out there is important.
Yeah, absolutely. What excites you?
What excites me? Back to the early comment I made about working at the bench and making discoveries, big or small, is really important for me. And so applying novel technologies, in our case, right now to prostate cancer, but in the future to breast cancer and lung cancer, in places where we've got great screening tools. You put 1 million people in a stadium and you can find out how many of them have cancer. That's great. But at what cost? Because if half the stadium is falsely positive, that's not a good test either. So being able to maintain sensitivity for a disease when it's actually there, and yet raise specificity, thereby lowering the number of unnecessary procedures and lowering the costs of the health system, that kind of drives me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Bob Rochelle, thank you so much for being on the Life Science Success Podcast. I greatly appreciate you being here and for telling us about Cleveland Diagnostics and the things that you're working on there. I wish you the best. And yeah, thanks a lot for being on.
My pleasure, Don. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.